Let's talk about something that's becoming increasingly important for enterprise companies worldwide: cyber risk management. Traditionally, cyber risk has been managed manually in silos, separate from the business's core operations. The future is about getting real-time risk insights benchmarked against your industry peers through automation. And CyberSaint's CyberStrong platform is leading the charge. CyberStrong is not just another point solution, it's a revolutionary platform. It's a quantified top-down risk approach where your unique cyber risk informs C-suite decision-making to identify your top 5 cyber risks and the controls to mitigate them. Sign up for your free cyber risk analysis by visiting securityweekly.com/cybersaint.
On the Security Weekly News, I try to scan and produce a quick look at some of the major stories to help you keep up with what's going on in and around the industry in a short format. Myself, Aaron Leyland, Josh Marpet, and other guest commentators provide greater insight every week. I'm Doug White, and I hope that you'll look for the Security Weekly News in all of your favorite podcast catchers and subscribe for the latest content.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Ben Carr. Maximize your investment at Black Hat 2024 with a one-on-one on-site interview. Drive thought leadership and boost brand awareness with Cyber Risk Alliance's expert editorial team from Security Weekly and SC Media. Act now. Limited interview slots available. Secure yours today by visiting securityweekly.com/Black Hat 2024. Jeff Recor recently formed his own risk management consulting company after leaving Accenture as the global integrated risk management practice lead. Jeff brings over 30 years of experience in all aspects of risk and compliance management, information security, and other risk-related disciplines across multiple system integrators, including Deloitte and Grant Thornton. Over his career, Jeff has served as a director of information security, in addition to his 25 years of consulting experience. Jeff, welcome, finally, to Business Security Weekly.
Thank you, Matt. I'm very glad to be here.
So, just so everybody knows, I tried to get Jeff on the show a few years ago at the Christmas party. Unfortunately, he got grounded in Detroit in a snowstorm, so he couldn't make it in.
Yeah, how lucky to be grounded in your own hometown. I was actually passing through Detroit on my way out to you and got stuck, so I just could turn around and go home.
Yeah, hopefully you didn't get stuck at the airport in your own hometown and you were at least able to make it home. That would be insult to injury, Jeff.
That's right, I was, and I had a hard time trying to explain to the ticket agent that I didn't need to get a hotel, like I just needed my bag and I could drive home because that was in my hometown, so that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. So a little more history. Jeff and I have known each other for a long time. We worked together when I was at RSA. Jeff was at Deloitte. He's one of the best well-known experts in risk management. And I thought it would be a great time to bring him on after our interview with Sumedh Thakar, talking about the CEO CISO communications gap. And what I really want to dig into, Jeff, with you is, what do CEOs and boards really need when it comes to risk management? And how does that tie into security?
Yeah, so this is a really good discussion from my perspective because of all the various experience I've had from the big four and then going to smaller SIs, right, and dealing with boards at various size companies and industries. And what impacts this the most for me is the last couple of years, right? And if you think about what we've gone through from COVID, coming out of COVID to the SEC stuff and, really Uber and some of the other court cases, SolarWinds and some of those, right? Even you could even talk about Twitter and the resignations with Twitter and some of the fines there. It's really been fascinating, right? And we get the number one question we get to that extent, Matt, between, from CISOs and what do they need and how do they do it and how do they report is more around how are they going to stay out of trouble, right? If they have all this accountability and they have all this responsibility, but they don't have the leadership, they're not a director in a lot of cases, right? They don't formally sit on any boards, they don't lead subcommittees, they're trying, right? That whole thing. Some do, but a lot still don't. It's a really weird time to be in that position. So when we get the question, what do boards want from CISOs? It's really fascinating to kind of sit down and talk around what the market trends are. Forget the SEC stuff, forget all the legal liability stuff for a second, and just talk about how do you actually link what you're doing to the objectives of the business? That's a fascinating conversation, right? And just having boards understand what technology is, what its impact is to the business, cost, ROI, all of that related to how I take advantage of that. We had a CISO say to us from a major insurance company that he felt his biggest competitors weren't his regional or national, you know, other insurance companies. They were Apple and Netflix and Amazon, and so I think the landscape is changing, almost like a Rubik's cube on multiple dimensions, and it's pretty troubling if you're a CISO right now.
Yeah, and I think boards are still trying to figure this out a little bit, right? They're like, what is it that boards want from a risk management perspective? Are we losing Jeff again?
I can still hear you. It's just my webcam picture's gone.
Interesting. Uh, so, when I think about this from a risk management perspective, because I still think this is a risk issue, right? But w- a lot of CISOs aren't talking to their boards in a risk kind of discussion. And so, how do you bridge that gap? Because if you can't equate it, and you talked about objectives, and maybe it is an objective to risk mapping or something like that out there that doesn't exist yet, but I'm not sure is it that simple?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the big changes it was this whole upside downside risk thing coming out of COVID, right? And really CISOs realizing that they could showcase very easily how to add value to the business in a positive way. That's what we mean by upside risk, as opposed to just worrying about keeping hackers out and all the perceptions related to downside risk, right? And really becoming linked with the business, which is a key term you hear everywhere, right? Everybody talks about how CISOs need to link to the business, and that's very true, but there's various ways to doing that. And even if you take the board away for a second, how a CISO now has to integrate across the business because they have the best viewpoint, right? One of the market trends you see today, for example, is dual roles of CISOs, right? CIOs, CISOs, architects, CISOs. You have these dual roles forming now for that reason because of the visibility that they have. So that's where we get a lot of more inquiries from CISOs is about, look, how do I not only run my business in a way that helps everybody else across the board, but then how do I also link to objectives? And how do I show that I'm linking to objectives? The thing with cyber, the thing that's always driven me, you got how to measure anything in cybersecurity, right? You've got kind of the movements with Searson and Hubbard and RiskQuant in general across the board. When you hear the term, how do I put things in financial terms to the board, everybody immediately goes to risk quant, and that's not really the case, right? There's all sorts of ways that the board can understand value coming out of this cyber kind of line of business and help it achieve its objectives. But that's where I see board struggle, is trying to make that business leap between what the objectives are of that organization and what they're trying to do strategically.
So when you think about objectives, Jeff, for a second, right? Do you I mean, they could be global to the entire company, they could be by business unit. Is it really kind of mapping those key objectives across the business areas and then trying to figure out how to align them to potential risks that can impact those objectives? Is that a really good way to think about that?
I think it is. I think you're spot on, right? And if you look at the way that ISO defines things, right, 31,000 says that's exactly what the definition of risk is, right? Measuring uncertainty to objectives. I think the thing that's really interesting from the consulting side of the house, the various ways in which consulting organizations have been engaged to help clients build risk programs, even coming out of 2008 with the big meltdown, right? Risk programs were started, basically burned to the ground and started over after the bank meltdown in 2008. And they were rebuilt primarily the same way, right? Basel added a few more domain structures to it, right? And another, but by and large, risk management programs were built where accountability wasn't at the front line. It was still a second, third line kind of thing. And so you had people pretending to do risk, right? They were doing checkbox compliance stuff as opposed to risk stuff. And we see that a lot. I mean, there's still organizations that don't have CISOs, for God's sakes, right? Or they might have them in name only, but not any authority to actually do anything or control budgets or even drive any of the business. So, the neat thing is, God, I would love to write a book someday with everything that we've seen. But we dealt with a company that's been in business 110 years. They just added the CISO role. Like, you can't make this stuff up,
Well,
right? So
and then
I think there's always been
we've
this
seen
attitude.
we've seen
Go ahead, Tom.
recently in recent events where people hire a CISO, but are they qualified to actually be the CISO? Right? Does the board, does the E staff know what they want in a CISO? Are they hiring the right person? Matt, you mentioned about this whole question of what does the board want to know? But how many times is the board actually having a conversation with the CISO? Right? Is it filtered through other executive staff members and gets second, third hand to the CISO? Right? And so I think we talked about on the last discussion with Samed, it's that bi-directional conversation and actually having a conversation and not a dictate, like the CEO taking time to sit down, the E-staff members, the CFO, chief legal, sitting down and taking time to have recurring conversations to help the CISO understand, but also to understand themselves about the business side of security and how they can work better to deliver this risk quantification and better decision making.
Agreed. But the other side of that coin is, do they even understand what they're trying to do, right? So the number one thing that I've always asked, if you look at the market, the thing that's fascinating me is look at the standards and guidelines that exist. Like, and Matt's heard me rail on this before, and I've railed on this at other industry groups, right? Is there, for example, a standard that tells anyone how to aggregate and correlate risk anywhere? No.
No,
Is there a standard that can help you get and weight IT risk to ops risk?
no,
No, right?
not really.
So you can, and then people will push back at me a little bit here, rightly so. That the NIST Caesar framework is out there, and it tells you kind of things that should be put together. It doesn't tell you how to do it.
Right.
Nobody does, right? Nobody does, and there's probably a good reason for that, right? There's also a reason, and you've heard me say this 1,000 times before, that risk consulting teams are the smallest business units inside of all the consulting groups, all the consulting companies. There's a reason for that, right? Nobody really spends a lot of money for consulting groups to come in and help them with risk programs. It's usually via compliance initiatives or cybersecurity initiatives or other things, right? So we've always taken the attitude that if we have to Trojan horse some of this stuff to help clients and leverage technology, further, like a Russian egg kind of thing, right? Where if that's how we have to do it, then that's how we have to do it. Because normally when money's getting allocated to things that are material, right, it usually comes from a finding from a regulator, and then money gets spent to go fix things. It's very rare to see, although 2008 changed this a little bit, but it's very rare to see companies take a step back and say, okay, I really need to look at risk and do this the right way.
Yeah, that's what scares me about all these reboots after the '08, right? Because, I think about that lead up to '08, Sarbanes-Oxley coming in early 2000, driving to the '08 crash, right? Very control compliance focus. '08 puts us right back there, right? So here we are in a world, I think, where compliance isn't as big a driver. Now, I don't think it goes away, Jeff. But I'm going to tell you, non regulated industries are getting pressured to do something around cyber risk without a compliance mandate. And so, don't we have to flip the model? Like, if we keep doing it the way we've been doing it, kind of from the compliance control up, but you don't have that compliance mandate to drive it, somehow we have to flip this into a cyber risk conversation, don't we?
Yeah, you would think so, right? 9 times out of 10, though, it's a control conversation that back ends into risk, right? And that's just the reality of it. And I would love to sit here and tell you, if I put my consulting hat back on, yeah, right. Oh, it's all about risk, and we got to do that right. But 9 times out of 10, it's, control harmonization, and let's get more efficient with the way that we test controls, right? And that's where if you look at where the revenue gets spent in the market, that's where the big amount of revenue is. So I do think, though, and why I get excited about this and why I decided to kind of go off on my own little Easter egg hunt here on my own LLC is AI is going to change this. It is. Risk has always been difficult. It's been something that people, like, you start talking about risk appetite and risk tolerance, and people immediately will start rolling their eyes. That is the reality, right? And so it's a necessary evil. People do it indirectly. Everybody does it when they go out every day, right? You make a decision to get in your car, you're making risk decisions, you go to cross the street. Everybody does it. But I don't think anybody really realizes how important it is in their day to day business decisions. One, they're not rewarded for it in any way, shape, or form. It's not tied to performance, which is something that's got to change culturally. And two, what's the number one driver for budgets, right? Breaches.
Yeah.
It always comes after breaches, always, right? So that's the opportunity here. And I do think that's why AI hopefully can change things because it takes risk modeling, which let's be honest, right? Not everybody's a data scientist. Not everybody's got access to being a data scientist. Risk modeling can be difficult and it can be intimidating for people that just want to do their job, right? And so if you're trying to just be efficient, you don't want to get in and dig under the covers of risk modeling. I mean, that we've always heard that. We've got that feedback from everybody. So AI can take away that drudgery of trying to understand the difficult components to how things actually work under the covers. And if you can understand the levers you need to pull in order to get to what you need to get to for visibility, I think that's what AI can do. And I'm starting to see some real promising things there.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a data problem at the end of the day, right?
Yep.
I mean, we were talking to Samet about it. It's not just about the number of vulnerabilities, but it's also exploits, what's exploitable, et cetera. And so that's a that's a potentially a really big data model that AI can probably crunch and munch and spit out something that is a little more intelligible than we humans trying to put this together in Excel spreadsheets. Because look, that's how most of us are doing it, right? Because I've looked at all these models. Like I'm pretty sure I've run across some of your old models. Like these spreadsheets are super complex, Jeff, which is
Yep.
why it's hard, but number two, why nobody wants to deal with it because it's all these freaking macros sitting in Excel spreadsheets trying to figure out based on the threats and the vulnerabilities and likelihood and impact, like what should I quantify this thing between a 0 and 100 scale? And you're like, oh my God, my brain wants to melt.
Well, then you throw assets into that and weighting assets and value there, and it just becomes more exponential. SecOps, right? It becomes more exponentially difficult. And so the one thing I would tell you, Matt, is if we're just sitting around having this conversation, there is another side to that coin, which is I personally believe culture is a bigger block than the data part of it. I think the data part can be fixed. I think it can be addressed, even in simple terms. Like, and I know you have a lot of examples. Ben, you probably do too. But I've seen clients, come in with, oh, we got 170 KRI, we're going to manage to now help us get it down to something a little bit more manageable, right? People understand functionally how to kind of get to where they need to get to. They might not agree on it, 10 times out of 10, it's culture related.
Hmm.
Silos, personalities, people not wanting to give up power. Like you can go through the list, but cultural challenges just run amok in corporations and knock this thing down all the time.
So that kind of leads me back to my what do CEOs and boards really need? Because I guess it really has to start with the board and the CEOs, right? If culture is going to get changed in an organization, Jeff, if it's not coming from the top, it's not going to get done. So why aren't boards and CEOs pushing more of this, especially under some of the new SEC reporting requirements, et cetera? Like, why aren't we seeing? I think we're seeing some push, but why aren't we seeing more push?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question, right? The way I look at this strategically and operationally, right? Strategically and tactically. So the tactical answer to that question is because I don't think boards have really understood what a CISO does day to day and what the impact is on the business. And I've seen pushback, and I've done it personally. I'm not going to bring up any names, but I've sat on boards, and I've had board members lean over to me and say, "Hey, I understand what you're talking about because I know what email is." Right? I mean, so the people on the boards, generally speaking, and I don't mean to denigrate that, but you get what I'm saying, right? There is a technical kind of divide and intimidation factor that comes from CISOs trying to sit on boards. Not all of them. Some of them are very, very good, but by and large, it's a technical business, right? And that's been the struggle with CISOs and why they average 3 years of, or whatever it was of viability when in each company, I think was the last study I saw. So I think the strategic piece, Matt, to your point, is more important. And that is the number one thing that I've seen is that people really can't articulate objectives at an operational level. The board knows strategically what it wants to do. For example, increase customer sat 5% year over year, or add 5% more new brands, whatever, right? Very high level, they understand strategically what they want to do. How that translates into execution amongst all the lines of business, not just CISOs, but all the lines of business, because the CISO has to support those objectives across all the lines, right? That's where the challenge comes in. And we have, as consultants, we have a hard time getting people to articulate what their objectives are. They immediately go to the budget and say, well, this is the funding I got. And then I go, well, how did you get the funding? Like, what argument did you use to get the funding for the projects that you had? And then there's this circular logic, right? So I think that's where there needs to be a bigger focus on actually defining objectives, actual objectives that can be managed and monitored. And this is all like old school MBO stuff, right? When we were going through business school back in college, that's what this is. And we kind of got away from it. Everybody wants to build the best cyber program and lock the bad guys out, but it misses the whole point of what the business is doing in the first place.
Yeah. And I guess that it's a little shocking to me that a company it can't articulate its objectives, because I'm used to doing OKRs, Jeff, right?
Yeah.
Like the last 3 companies I work for have been OKR focused, right? Which is set your objectives, then set down your key results to measure against that objective. If that's not in the root of a business,
Yeah,
like,
Matt,
is there even a
like
business?
getting a company to put any cyber objective into those OKRs, hard, really, really hard, but key to
But
changing a culture.
yeah, but all right. So here's where I think it gets interesting. I'd love Jeff's point on this. Business objectives to key results to measure that. I don't think those get tied to security. I think they get tied to risks. And
Right.
then risks get tied to security, right? If I'm going to restructure this thing, objective, key result, risk, and then how do I mitigate the risk? Well, it's a set of controls or security mechanisms that mitigate that. So, is that the future of what this language needs to be? Because we're talking from a risk perspective with Samed, right? And why risk is so important. But to tie it back, it's almost an objective key result to risk mapping now,
It
I
is. I
think.
agree with that 100%. But
Okay.
but I will tell you, even some of my peers in my former job and in the Big Four don't agree with that. And I'm not, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just saying there's a lot of variability about really what should be done there, right?
Hmm.
In the market, there isn't like an overwhelming agreement that objectives should be messed with at all. It, as far as a CISO and being able to craft the program, right? But I mean, it's just common sense at this point. Like, if you don't understand where you're marching and how you're helping everybody march to get there, then what are you doing, right? At the end of the day, so that's where I see the struggles, because if I turn around and say to you, and I've done this with my teams, right? When we go into certain industries and clients ask us for help in defining this stuff, I would even argue a lot of people don't even understand what OKRs are, but that's a whole different topic for later. But you have some companies obviously that do that, but for the ones that don't, this is where it gets really fascinating, because you have to have them sit down and agree that if their strategic objective at the board level is to land 150 new clients, and just making something up now, then this is how we all measure ourselves against that objective. And that exercise is just really difficult to get
Mhm.
through.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand it having gone through it a couple times, but it does give us a structure to work from, right?
It
Because
does. And here's the interesting thing, Mike. I'll tie that back around to your risk point, right? Which is, now you have a reason to actually do a risk assessment. Before, risk assessments just become check the box kind of exercises, right? And they don't really result towards anything other than you got to fix a couple things and go through the cycle, right? But if now you're doing an assessment around those risks that are limiting your impact to achieve that objective, you actually can go to the board and ask for support and ask for help very directly, and the board's job is to get that to you. Whereas if you're just doing a risk assessment to go check to make sure controls are designed as they are, effective or whatever, you're not doing anything that's actually helping the business run. You And that's been my kind of complaint around the whole thing about what the cyber industry is driven to versus what business is doing. And those two seem to have gone like this, right? They haven't really kind of gone in lockstep, the standards, the guidelines, all of it. And now it's starting to try and come back a little bit, because look, let's face it, cybercrime's out of control. right? You read every day about billions of this being stolen and billions of those accounts being stolen. It's pretty bad right now.
Yeah, it is, and it we had again part of this conversation with Samed, which was like, boards are starting to ask questions about, okay, well, if I have to do something about it, how much? Like, right? They want to understand if I'm going to spend I think his example, Ben, was if I'm going to spend $1 million in an AI project to grow my revenue 20%, that's one decision versus spending $1 million to reduce how much cyber risk. Well, if you can't measure what the impact of that $1 million spend in security is, guess what the board's going to do? They're going to go give you $1 million to go fund that AI project because they understand that
Yeah,
it could have a
impact.
20% increase in revenue. They can't compare apples to apples, so they're in a bind.
Yeah, and I think that comes out in the questions that they ask and the lack of funding response to stuff, right? They're like, well, we spent all this money last year, and like, what was the net impact of the business? And it's like, well, we're safer. Well, how much? I don't know, right? But the challenge is there on sometimes on the cyber side, like it's not a zero sum game, or there's not a formula you plug it into, right? Like there's a lot of you're protecting against the potential for some of these things are even unknown, right? And we're seeing, I know some med made this comment, and I've seen it a lot in the vulnerability analysis of, well, let's not patch things that don't have an active, something active out there that's taking advantage of it. But the challenge is, and I see this specifically on the ransomware side, like people are burning 0 days because the calculus is no longer I'm a nation state and I don't need to burn the 0 day until I really need to. The calculus is now I'm going to burn that 0 day before somebody else does, and I'm going to take advantage of it, and I'm going to capitalize on the monetization of it, right? And so in a CISO's head, like trying to turn that into like we need to fix this stuff. Like, well, what's the likelihood of it happening? It's like it's this. It gets back to the logic of, well, it could, right? And it could is really hard for the board
Right.
to consume. So you have to do the impact, the analysis of the risk, the potential, like, and that's where this risk quantification, I think, really comes home. Is you need to know what the value of the systems are, what the impact potentially is to the business, and the likelihood, and work that out so you can comment back in a business based answer and say, look, there's a 30% likelihood we estimate of it happening. We could be wrong, right? But margin of error. And here's the cost to the business if that did happen, right? And that's a valid discussion I think you can start to motivate people with.
And I think it's a valid conversation starting to happen in boardrooms, Jeff, isn't it?
It is. And that's right now probably the most common discussion being had. And it's being taught in a lot of places right now. And it's kind of how everybody looks at CRQ, right? If you look at it that way. I think the next iteration, what I'm hoping to see is that it gets to the next step of not necessarily looking at here's all the vulnerabilities and all the threats we got to deal with, and here's the potential impact, and then here's where we maybe need to spend money. I would much rather see it go, here's the objectives we have, here's the risk related to those objectives, and here's the money we need to spend in order to mitigate those risks. We'll manage the business. The tactical part, the operational part of the business is just normal operations, but this is where we need to drive the business. That's the conversation that I want to see have happen, and I don't see that happen
Well,
very
and
often.
to your point about not happening, I was going to ask you, like, Matt said that's the conversation starting to happen. But what I've seen, I'm interested if you're seeing something different, is the conversation is starting to happen at the board, but it's kind of like it's talking into an echo chamber, right? Like the board's asking questions of
Yeah,
itself that doesn't have the fundamental understanding. They may reach out to the CEO and say, how are you handling this? But the vacuum exists between the CISO or the person responsible for a security program in a lot of cases and the people trying to make decisions, and the two are never really tightly integrating and having that fundamental discussion to come up with an involved decision. You agree?
yeah, and I started to make this point earlier. Myself included, right? Serving on boards, and other people have very publicly come out and talked about this too, and that's why I won't mention any names. But you get frustrated being the token cyber guy on the
Yeah.
board, right? And I say it that way because of Ben, the point you're making, which is you show up, you tell a couple horror stories. Everybody wants to hear about the hacking stories that I did 20 years ago, or the catching the bad guy stuff with the FBI, right? All that stuff, but they don't really want to sit down and have that
Yeah.
key conversation about here's what we need to do, here's what the business looks like, right? And you're the popular person on the board, because of those stories and because you're dealing with stuff that is in the press as a boogeyman every day. But that's where I think we need to make this leap. And now, all of these bad things happening and some of the legal stuff now, you're starting to see that change. And I don't mean to be overly glib about this, but for every good company that you can say they're doing it right, the board's asking the right questions, we got the right CISO in place, things are happening. There's probably 1,000 that aren't, and that's the problem right now.
Having sat through a number of board meetings, guess what 2 areas of the business always gets covered? Sales,
Yeah.
right? Sales. Where are we from a sales perspective? And where are we from a budget cost perspective, right? And if I sit back and think about those are always covered at the board meeting because everybody wants to understand revenue, cost to determine profitability, especially public companies that have to report, right? If CISOs aren't putting security in and how it impacts those 2 areas, which are always covered, I think, Ben, to your point, there's always going to be this air gap or echo chamber that will never get solved.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Like that's the challenge. That's what I've seen. It's just we're I mean, exactly to your point, like sales is always talking, right? Like people are always having that conversation, right? But we're not seeing security as an enabler to the business. We're not seeing it as a core metric of the business. And so as a result, it gets kind of pushed to the wayside. It's seen by the board and the E-staff, I think, as a technical component, like just do your stuff and it'll get addressed. And that discussion that's fundamental to having a healthy program and changing the culture isn't happening.
I do think COVID started to drive that change a little bit, right? I had seen those conversations change during COVID because CISOs were thrust into the spotlight, whether they liked it or not, because of all the remote work, home working stuff that had to happen and everything else, right? So, but I saw a lot of and was part of a lot of online meetings where CISOs were actually asked their opinion about how to drive revenue and things that could be done differently. It was very cool, and so I think some of that momentum has come out now. And I just hope it stays.
Yeah, so I guess if you're a CISO, if you're not aligning to business objectives somehow with your program, you're going to have a very, very hard time communicating with your CEOs and your boards to get the budgets you need to actually reduce those risks. That's what I hear. Jeff?
I agree fully. I think that's a number one priority, and anybody considering that, there's 2 things. There's that, and then make sure you get D&O insurance to cover yourself.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we've talked about that one as well on this show. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening today. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.